been difficult for a former member of the official IRA, as I was growing up in the 70s, and my only contact with the British Army was not pleasant. But my contact with John has been super pleasant. The book that he has written is an attempt at telling the truth. I've almost finished it, and it's absolutely a fantastic book. And it's not just a sale pitch to tell you to buy it. What I found out about it was, at the heart of it, he talks to the former combatants in the army, provisional IRA, and other people. But at the very heart of it is the victims. And what's happened in Northern Ireland is that not enough truth-telling of the victims has been told. And I said to John earlier, did you get any criticism from the provisionals IRA? He says, I did. Did you get any criticism from your former comrades? He said, I did. John, I'm here to tell you that you've succeeded in telling the truth. John, thank you very much. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Henry. That's incredibly kind of you to say so. Well, good afternoon, Hertford. So, are we having a good time? Well, obviously that stops now. I'll try and ruin it for you. When Henry asked me to come and speak today, Bev was put in charge. Hello, Bev. Of looking after me, and I was a bit nervous. I've never been to a literary festival before, let alone spoken at one. And I asked Bev what it was going to be like, and she goes, don't worry, it's like chatting with friends after a dinner party. And I don't know what the kind of dinner parties that Bev has, but I definitely don't have this many people round at my house. It's simple as that. But what I want to talk to you about this afternoon is, as Henry said, my book, Death in the Fields. It's about the IRA, and specifically it's about their East Tyrone Brigade. But before I start, can I just ask, apart from Henry, are there any current or former members of the IRA in the audience? Just checking, absolutely sure. Yeah, I've got you, Henry. Yeah, that's fine. Now, the reason I asked that question is I normally write books about the Second World War. And a few years ago, I wrote one about the Nazi SS and their role in the war. And I was giving a talk to a bunch of Rotarians up in Durham about it. And as I started, a gentleman at the back very politely put his hand up. And I said, yes, sir, what would you like to say? He said, I remember when I was captured by the SS in Italy in 1943. And that taught me to never second-guess the experience of the audience and always ask. Because they usually know more than I do. So why the IRA and why their East Tyrone Brigade in particular? And really, it's personal experience. You know, write what you know, as they always say. And in the early 90s, my first job was in the British Army, and my first operational tour was in Northern Ireland, and specifically in East Tyrone. And at that time, the East Tyrone Brigade were known as one of the most deadly and efficient units in the IRA, along with the South Armagh Brigade. And in those days, the British Army, a battalion would typically train for 6 months before they went on a tour in the province. Because the British Army always took the IRA very, very seriously. They were extremely good at what they did, and they were very, very effective. And if you weren't trained and ready to deal with that, then they would add to their tally of hundreds and hundreds of soldiers and policemen who they'd already killed. But what brought it home to me was you can train for 6 months and so on. And we went over there, and I was on my first patrol. I've been there about a day. And we were flown out by helicopter to the start of our patrol route. And I'll come on to why, but we were always flown by helicopter because the roads were too dangerous to travel by vehicle. The IRA were constantly mining them, and so chances are you get blown up. So we dropped off from the helicopter, and I led the patrol off, and the first place that we came to was a farm. It's a very rural area, and it was the farmer was a well-known member of the provisional IRA. He was a bomb maker, and he was in his mid-30s. He'd been doing it a long time. You know, he joined when he was 17, 18, so he absolutely knew what he was doing. And I was patrolling through his farmyard, and he was there loading bales of hay into his wagon, and he saw me, and he just stopped. And I will always remember, look, and he stopped, and he was still, absolutely still. And then when I got closer to him, I realized actually he wasn't still, he was quivering. And he was not quivering with fear, that's for sure. And his fists were clenched by his side, and his face was contorted, and his eyes, and it was utter and total rage and hatred. And he didn't know me. He'd never met me. He didn't know my name, anything. All he could see was a uniform, and it was a uniform that he detested to the bottom of his soul. And I absolutely knew that, without a doubt, that if he could get away with it, he would try and kill me with his bare hands on the spot. And it really kind of brings it home to you what you're doing over there for the 6 months that we spent on the tour. Now, the book is based on a whole series of in-depth interviews. That's what I always base my books on, with veterans from all sides, so former British Army soldiers like myself, members of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the police force out there, the Ulster Defence Regiment, loyalist paramilitary organisations, the Ulster Volunteer Force, for instance, and former provisionals. And I spent a lot of time out there interviewing these individuals and trying to tell the story of what went on over the time from the beginning of the Troubles in 1969 up until first IRA ceasefire in 1994, and trying to root it in history, because that's what they most definitely do. For the people of Northern Ireland, it didn't just start in 1969. It started, way before. For the IRA and so on, they look back to Anglo-Norman invasions in the 1100s, and they see that as a historical context. So to give you some kind of geographical context as to Northern Ireland itself and to East Tyrone, does anyone here, apart from Michael, come from Northern Ireland? Hello? Oh, can I ask, madam, where you're from in Northern Ireland? Hillsborough, got you, sir? Fermanagh, sir? Belfast, thank you very much. I know Fermanagh quite well. I don't know Hillsborough or Belfast. I don't know Belfast well at all. But to give you some kind of context as to it, it's not a big place. So you can drive across it, north, south, east, west, 2.5 hours without breaking the speed limit. In terms of population, it's about the same as Hampshire, population of Northern Ireland. And East Tyrone is a very small part of that. There are 6 counties. There's Down, Antrim, Londonderry, Fermanagh, Armagh, and Tyrone. Tyrone's the largest. But East Tyrone itself is a small place. There are 2 large towns. Well, the 2 largest towns. There's Cookstown in the north, Dungannon in the south. Now, their combined population is less than Hertford. And beyond that, it's mainly small villages, isolated farmsteads and hamlets. It's a very, very rural place. And those farms have been passed down through the same families for generations and generations. And the other important thing to note about the place is that the population is 50-50, so it's half Roman Catholic, half Protestant. And they live cheek by jowl. They really do live next door to each other. And that's one of the most fascinating and gruesome things about researching the book was that these people are so close to each other, and they can point to each other in the street. They shop at the same supermarkets. They go and have coffee in the same places. They usually don't drink in the same pubs. But apart from that, their lives are intertwined. And that's partly what makes what went on so difficult for many to talk about. Now, when the Troubles first started in 1969, really, and I'm generalising, I do apologise, it was Belfast. That was where it was really going on. It spread to Derry City, but in terms of the countryside, and particularly East Tyrone, it was a bit late in coming. It didn't really kind of reach there until 70, 71. And even then, it was a small number of individuals who managed to get a hold of a few guns, and it was Wild West. So guys like Kevin Mallon, Brendan Hughes, and Tommy Hamill would literally pick up a rifle or a pistol, and they would leave their house and go hunting for policemen and soldiers who were in vehicles travelling by at the time, and they would try and ambush them and cause as many casualties as they could. After a few years, they realised this wasn't as effective as they would like it to be. So they moved into explosives. And they try and get hold of commercial explosives, gelignite, TNT, and so on, but most of the time they couldn't get hold of that. So they made it themselves. And homemade explosives, I won't embarrass Henry, I'm sure he knows how to make it far better than I do. But it's based on agricultural fertilizer. So ammonium nitrate, they want the fertilizer to have as high a concentration as possible, and you grind it in basically like an industrial coffee grinder. This is probably recorded, so I'll probably get arrested by MI5 after this for spreading and then you mix it with diesel oil. You know, I won't tell you the rate, but anyway, you mix it in a certain ratio, and then you pack it into milk churns, beer kegs, and so on. And what they did with it, and they would typically make 200, 300 pounds of the stuff by weight, is that they would pack it into culverts in the roads where obviously streams and so on would go underneath, wait for an army or a police vehicle to go by. They'd be at a firing point where they'd either have a remote control, so antenna, or very James Bond, or it would be command wire most of the time, so just a wire next to a button box, wait until we got over it, boom, bang, and then cause as many casualties as they could, and so on. And it did get to the point where they were so successful, particularly through the early and mid-80s, that they blew us off the roads, essentially. And after one incident in 1988 where they blew up a coach of soldiers coming back from leave from the light infantry, they killed 8 and badly wounded at least a dozen more. And then the order went out that we were no longer allowed to travel on the roads in vehicles. So from then onwards, it was either on foot or helicopters. But as the brigade was getting better at what it was doing, it came across one of the huge issues that the IRA always had, which is lack of money. Because wars are really expensive. And of course, they don't have access to what the British government has in terms of general taxation and so on. Typically, the IRA would fund itself, and all paramilitary organisations over there, the Protestants were exactly the same. They would fund it through criminality. So they would rob banks, post offices, racketeering. So the classic, walk into the pub or the shop and what have you and say, if you don't give us X, unsurprisingly, it's going to burn down, or you're going to get beaten up, or whatever it is. But they were always looking for more funding because they just didn't have enough coming through. And East Tyrone, and Kevin Mallon, who was heading the brigade up at the time, thought he had the solution. And his solution was kidnap and ransom. And they specifically targeted, I don't particularly know why, but they targeted supermarket executives in the Republic, in the South, and they would kidnap them, demand £1-2 million, get the money, and then the individual will be handed over unharmed. But one of the first of their victims wasn't a human being at all. It was a horse, and it was a racehorse, and it was a horse called Shergar. I don't know whether any of you remember that. So Shergar was owned. The majority owner was the Aga Khan, who's a Shia religious leader, and the minority shareholders were a syndicate. Shergar had won the Derby and so on, was meant to be the most valuable horse in the world. And they put him out to stud in the Republic, and Kevin Mallon led a team that broke into the stud. The idea of getting Shergar into a horse box, getting him away to County Leitrim, where they had a barn ready waiting for him, demand a ransom, get paid, and there you go. But I've never dealt with racehorses, but apparently thoroughbred racehorses are very, very skittish. And you really need to know what you're doing in order to handle them. And if you don't, there's going to be trouble. And they didn't know what they were doing. So as they tried to get it into the horse box, it basically went a bit bananas, and it damaged one of its legs quite badly, and was just going potty in the back of this wagon. So by the time they got it to their safe house in Leitrim, and so on, it had hurt itself very badly, and they just couldn't calm the thing down. So they shot it. It was the only thing that they could really do at that stage. But then they obviously still went through with the ransom demand. It was £5 million. And of course, the minority shareholders, nobody knew, obviously, that the horse was already dead by that stage. they said to the Aga Khan, we'd like to meet and discuss this. And to his credit, he just refused and said, no, I don't treat with kidnappers. So there's no discussion at all. And so it ended not to be paid. And so the East Tyrone Brigade took the kind of hit for that. And they went through a bit of a doldrum period. And the IRA as a whole was still looking for where do we get, ideally, weapons and money. And lo and behold, out of nowhere, came their fairy godmother, who was a guy called Colonel Gaddafi, who at the time, very strange fairy godmother, I admit. But he was the dictator of Libya at the time. He'd already supplied the IRA with some weaponry in the 70s, as he did with a lot of paramilitary organisations and terrorist organisations across Europe. But at this stage, our Prime Minister was Margaret Thatcher. Ronald Reagan was President of the US. They were both very anti-Gaddafi, and they'd already bombed Tripoli. And in revenge, Gaddafi made an offer to the IRA that he would supply them with tons, and I mean tens of tons of weapons, as well as 5 million quid to help bankroll them. And we did manage, British security services did manage to get the last couple of shipments. They're obviously all shipments, they were by ship, but the majority of the weaponry got through, and it was hundreds of AK-47 assault rifles, several million rounds of ammunition, several tons of Semtex high explosive, Dushka heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, surface-to-air missiles, you name it. And that arsenal became really what enabled the IRA to continue its war right until the end. And when they did decommission and destroyed their weapons, well, some of it, that was the majority of the weaponry they destroyed. It was all Libyan supplied. A lot of those weapons ended up with the East Tyrone Brigade because they were a very, very successful unit for the IRA. And they used them for what they called their Liberated Zones campaign. Because, of course, they bordered, along with Armagh and Fermanagh, they bordered the Republic. And so their plan, which they kind of nicked from Chairman Mao, was that they were going to clear a strip of land on the Northern Irish side of the border by attacking and blowing up all of the isolated RUC stations, police stations across the border, and kill the policemen that were in them, obviously. And those stations were manned part-time, and typically they would close at 7 in the evening, and the policemen would change into civilian clothes, jump into their own cars, and go home. And from about 1985, the East Tyrone Brigade started their campaign, and they attacked about 20 of the stations, Ballagorley, the Birches, Carrickmore, Tynan, and so on. And it was a very, very successful campaign. And the team that carried out almost all of it really got a reputation, and they became known as the A-Team. Does anyone remember the 1980s TV show, George Peppard, Mr. T? That's where they got their nickname from. And there were 8 of them, and the team was split into 2. So half the guys were older, so early 30s. They'd been terrorists for a long, long time, and they were very, very experienced individuals. And the other 4 were young guys, 19 to 21, who were being, in effect, taught the ropes. That was the idea, and together as a unit, they were incredibly effective. And then in 1987, they happened on their next target, and they decided they were going to attack the RUC station in a little village in North Armagh called Lochgall. And they were going to attack it on the night of Friday, the 8th of May, in 1987, and they put a plan together, and it was a large-scale operation, at least 14 volunteers involved, and the plan was that they would have most of the team would be in a Toyota Hiace van that they'd stolen earlier that day, and they'd be the gun team, and behind them would be a JCB digger that they'd stolen from a nearby farm to Lochgall, and they put a 200-pound Semtex bomb in the bucket at the front, literally with a fuse that you'd light with a Zippo, just like in the films. And so the plan was that they were going to go down the main street of Lochgall. As I said, it is a very small place. Gunmen would get out of the van, open fire on the police station, whilst the JCB digger driver would crash that through the security barriers up to the police station itself, light the fuse, run off, boom, station blown apart, all the RUC inside gone, successful operation, then down south, because it's a few miles from the border, into Monaghan town for a very good weekend. So the operation got going, and the vehicle convoy was in front. They had a normal civilian car with a driver who was a scout, and so he was dressed in normal clothes, no balaclava or anything like that, no weapons. He just got a walkie-talkie. So if he runs into an army or a police checkpoint, he can then tell them, the boys behind, don't come down this route, go another route. He's got a Toyota van behind him. They're all loaded in. They're all in overalls, plimsolls, which they put on specifically for the operation, balaclavas, and marigold gloves. They tended to wear because, of course, they're skin tight. And, of course, that way you don't leave fingerprints on anything, and you can just take them off afterwards, and there's no forensics from the gunshots. And then you've got the JCB digger behind that, and then another scout vehicle at the rear that would then, in effect, be checking what's coming behind them, making sure they weren't being followed or what have you. So they get to Lochgall. Scout vehicles draw off because, of course, they're waiting for the attack to go in, and then they drive in and pick up the team and to take them down south. The gun team get out, they open fire on the station. Digger goes through the gates. Everything is going absolutely like clockwork. But what they didn't know was that the station was not manned by the local RUC constables at the time. It had an SAS unit in with specialist troopers from the RUC as well. And as soon as the IRA volunteers open fire, that triggers rules of engagement. Therefore, there is a threat to life, so you can open fire, which they did. And in a couple of minutes, they killed all 8 of the volunteers. And it was the largest loss the IRA had suffered since the War of Independence back in 1921 in a place called Clonmalt in County Cork. And it really, it petrified the IRA, and it petrified the East Tyrone Brigade in particular, because they were utterly convinced that the only way that could have been done was if there's informers among their own ranks. And actually, there's a lot of evidence to say they were right. There was a lot more to it. It wasn't just informers who gave the security forces the information. But that was for the brigade, it was an unbelievable setback. And for the next 5 years, the British security forces, their campaign against the East Tyrone Brigade was unmatched as to any other unit in the IRA. And there are lots of theories as to why East Tyrone was targeted and so on, and it's very difficult to actually know. One of the most prevalent is that the British, in effect, were using them as an example to try and shepherd the IRA towards peace, i.e. saying that war is not going to get you anywhere. Let's actually talk, and that's the way that we're going to end this. Because over the next 5 years, there was ambush after ambush after ambush. So the year after Lochgall, at a little place called Drumnachilly, a 3-man IRA team tried to assassinate a part-time member of the Ulster Defence Regiment, who was a coal delivery driver. His place had been taken by an SAS trooper, and when they tried to shoot him, again, another ambush, all 3 IRA men were killed. And then 2 years after that, in a village called Coke, another 3-man IRA team. In fact, their inquest, their coroner's inquest, has just finished yesterday in Belfast. I had to give a statement to the court about it. And yeah, so they again were trying to assassinate a part-time member of the Ulster Defence Regiment, and again SAS ambush. They drove into it, and all three were killed. And then the year after that, in a place called Coal Island, a 4-man team attacked the police station, and then as they tried to debus to another vehicle, the SAS again killed all 4 of them. And what was happening was that from Lochgall in 1987, the average age of the volunteers on that operation was 25 years old. When we get to Coal Island and Clonau in 1992, the average age was 20. And the senior members of the brigade were saying themselves they just didn't have anyone left. And the only ones they had were youngsters who, with no experience, very little training, and clearly there was no way that they were going to have to, they were going to be able to launch any operations in the state that they were at. But I mean, all of those kind of facts and figures don't really, bring it home, as Henry says, the kind of the personal side of it. Because going back to how large or how small East Tyrone is, everybody knew each other. So from both sides. So if you were a member of the Ulster Defence Regiment or the RUC, or you were a provisional IRA volunteer, you lived very, cheek by jowl with the people who were trying to kill you or you were trying to kill. And that made it very, very personal indeed. So there was one local man, a Protestant, called Glenn Espy. And in 1978, he was 20 years old, and he was a plumber with the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, who, they look after the social council housing in the area. And he was also a part-time member of the Ulster Defence Regiment. And he finished a job, it was Wednesday, 22nd of March. He'd finished a job, and his foreman said, "Glenn, number 3, Lakeview Cottages, Ardbow, they've got a burst water cylinder. Can you go down and sort it out?" Not a problem. Jumped in his van, drove down, knocked on the door. Door opens. Guy says, "Oh, yeah, it's water cylinder. It's up the stairs there." He goes back to the kitchen. Glenn's just about to climb the stairs, where the door to his right, downstairs loo, door opens, and there's a gunman standing there, balaclava, with a pistol, 2 hands, and of course opens fire. Hits Glenn in the chest. He said it was like being hit by a horse, and knocked him kind of almost out of the front door. He was hit again, and like most part-time members of the Ulster Defence Regiment, he was also carrying a personal protection weapon, a pistol himself. Somehow he managed to pull his pistol out, open fire at the gunman, and didn't hit him, but managed to get some time to run. And he was running around the estate, broke into an empty house, rang 999 on the phone. This is obviously all pre-mobiles. Was there a world pre-mobile? Rang the police, and of course asked for help, explained the situation, and they said no. Because what the provisionals did a lot was that they would ring up and claim there'd been an incident to try and draw army and the police into an area to then be attacked. So Glenn knew there was no help coming. He had to sort it out himself. So he left that house, searching for somewhere else. And there was a house on another road, a Mini parked in the garage door open. So and as luck would have it, the Mini was open and the keys were in the ignition. I mean, it was 1978. It was a very different time. So he then drove. How he drove, anyone's guess. Adrenaline still flowing, I should imagine. To a friend's house, a couple of miles away. Crashed into the driveway wall, and they came out and got medical attention, and he survived. But he knew his gunman. So the guy that shot him was a guy called Lawrence McNally. And Lawrence was a long-standing member of the IRA and a well-known gunman in the area. And Lawrence had 2 brothers, Phelim and Francie. And Francie was a local Sinn Féin councillor. He was also a member of the IRA. But their other brother, Phelim, had nothing to do with it. He wasn't a member and so on. And one evening in 1989, Phelim went round to Francie's, see his brother. He went into the kitchen to get a drink. And a loyalist gun team opened fire through the kitchen window and killed him. And they weren't going for him. Obviously, they were trying to get one of his 2 brothers, or hopefully both, in their view. But they didn't. But 30 months after that, Lawrence thought, great, I've managed to avoid that. 30 months later, he's then driving in the back of a red Vauxhall Cavalier that they'd stolen the previous evening. And he is going with 2 other volunteers, to ambush and kill a part-time member of the Ulster Defence Regiment, a guy called Alistair Hartness, in the village of Coke. And so they're on their way, and sitting next to him is a guy called Pete Ryan. And Pete, again, veteran IRA volunteer, long-standing member. His cousin Liam Ryan was the brigade intelligence officer and had been on the Loch Gall operation. He was one of the scouts. And he'd obviously survived that, unarmed. He'd left the ambush area. Only for 2 years later, he ran a pub called the Battery Bar in the village of Ardbow. And one night after a darts competition, an Ulster volunteer force gun team broke in and shot him dead. So that was Pete Ryan and his cousin. And then in the front seat driving was a guy called Tony Doris. Now, Doris, again, was an experienced volunteer, but he was younger than his passengers. Now, his uncle, Brendan, was also the commander of the IRA in Coal Island, his hometown. And he'd already had a brother who was in prison doing life sentence in the Maze for attacking Coal Island RUC station, throwing a bomb at it, and then he'd been shot, but survived, wounded, but was then convicted and imprisoned. And Tony's other cousin was her maiden name was Michelle Doris, but her married name is Michelle O'Neill. And you've probably seen her on the news and so on. She's a blonde-haired lady, and she's the head of Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland. And when and if they finally bring back power sharing at Stormont, she will be the First Minister of Northern Ireland. That's her position, and that's her right. And that's just how close it all was. And when I interviewed Glenn, he then kind of brought it all back, because you can say about Glenn, he's either the luckiest man in Northern Ireland or he's the unluckiest man. Because 9 years after they first tried to kill him, they decided to try again, if at first you don't succeed. I think that's the principle. And so in 1987, a couple of months before Loch Gall, Glenn was leaving his house to go to work one morning, checked underside of the vehicle for booby traps, as he always did, went down the drive, turned into the lane to go, and he's just about there when a car screeches to a halt in front of him, blocks his way, and two guys, balaclavas, assault rifles, jump out and start firing at him. So he's hit again. He must rattle when he walks, Glenn. That's the only thing I can think of, because he's wearing more bullets than anything I've ever seen. But he managed to get out of the passenger side of his car into the ditch, and then open fire with his pistol. So they're rattling away at each other. The two IRA volunteers then kind of give it up, jump back in their car, and they head off. Glenn, again, even though he's bleeding, manages to get to a friend's house and what have you, and get medical help, and survived. But he knew the two guys who tried to kill him that morning, and they died 2 months later in Loch Gall. Seeing and all of it now, Glenn still wanders around. He lives near Cookstown. He wanders around Cookstown and sees members of the various gun teams that were involved in the two attacks on him, and he knows who they are, and they know who he is, and so on, and they just kind of say hello to each other in a really weird way, I would think. Really quite strange. But the ceasefire came, and I went over and I've been researching the book for quite some time, and it was, for me, going back was absolutely fascinating, because back when I first did my tour out there, I was 24, and I know it's difficult to believe, but I'm not 24 anymore. And seeing the place, you do realise. At the time, I lived a subterranean life, so the bases were always getting mortared. So we either lived in hardened accommodation or underground. The only time you ever left a base was to go on patrol. So the only time you ever saw other human beings who were not in your unit was when you're on patrol, and you're, camouflaged, helmet, assault rifle, hand grenades, you name it. And I was saying to Michael, who's doing the filming today, earlier, it was again, surreal experience. I'd only been there about a fortnight, and we'd been out doing a long patrol, and we were meant to come back by helicopter into Dungannon when we were based. No helicopter available, so had to patrol back in. And so I was patrolling up the high street, and the barracks was on Castle Hill, so it's top of the hill. And I caught myself in a shop window as I was going up the high street. And of course, it's like a Saturday afternoon. And there's just people doing their shopping. And, you know, they're speaking same language as me. And I'm looking at myself and it was a Woolworths. That dates me, doesn't it? Woolworths is still around. So I'm looking at a Woolworths shop window, and I've got, helmet, assault rifle, and no one is paying me the slightest bit of attention. And I'm thinking, if I was walking around Hertford with an assault rifle, webbing and ammunition and so on, I might get a few weird looks. And it was just looking in Woolworths because everyone's doing pick and mix. I loved Woolworths pick and mix, and I was looking at them going, "Oh, I should pop in." I'm going, maybe not. Maybe give that one a bit of a break and wait till the tour's over. But it's been fascinating interviewing all of the veterans and hearing their stories. The sad thing about it all was that for many of the local people from both sides is it's no forgive and forget. They still very much feel that they're in it. And you know, the other side for them are the enemy and will always be the enemy, which I feel is a huge shame and incredibly sad. But I'm hoping that one day maybe they'll have a bit of forgiveness for each other.
John, thank you very much from the bottom of my heart.
Thanks very much. Thank you.